and welcome to this episode in our practical reinforcement learning series. So, in the last video, I explained to you what reinforcement learning is, and I also explained to you how it differs from the other paradigms of AI, such as supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Now, in this short episode, the goal is to help drive home the different components of reinforcement learning and also help you to really understand what it means to be involved in reinforcement learning. So, on this one slide, I'm going to try to explain to you how a dog might learn to associate benefits with fire and also dangers with fire. Okay, so from the down section here, let's imagine that this dog is cold because of course it's winter and it is feeling very cold. It's getting frozen. The question is, how will you as a human being be able to train this dog to associate warmth with fire? Okay, let's say you are tasked with training this dog to be able to associate warmth with fire or to learn the benefit of fire. How are you going to go about training the dog to understand the benefits and dangers of fire? It is almost impossible for you to convey this knowledge to the dog in any practical way except through trial and error and also rewards. Okay, so let's say from the downside here, this dog is feeling cold, and then it comes it stays a sufficient distance away from the fire, and so it begins to feel some warmth. So the cold begins to go away and it begins to feel some warmth. Okay, so let's say the goal of the dog is to stay warm as long as it is winter, as long as it is feeling cold, it wants to stay warm. Okay, so the dog learns that by staying close to the fire, it gets warm. So let's say the reward, the environment. So the environment here is going to be the room, the confinement where the dog and the fire place finds themselves. Okay, so that is the environment. And the agent here, like I said in the previous slide, sometimes you might mistaken it to be something like a robot, but it is actually the software or the container of the policy that governs the actions taken. So the agent here is not necessarily the dog, but it is the model in the dog's mind that helps it to associate fire with warmth and also know the dangers of fire. Okay, so the agent here we can say is the dog, but in actual sense is not the dog, even though the dog is acting based on what the agent tells it to do, like the policies that it has learned, the model that it has formed based on the trials and errors. Okay, so the dog stays a sufficient distance away from the fire and it begins to feel warm. So the environment gives it a reward of 5 because it is feeling warm, it is achieving its goal. Now let's say the dog is so cold it wants to get warm as quickly as possible. So it keeps going closer and closer and closer and closer to the fire. So let's say midway between where the dog is now and the fire, so that is going to be here where I'm hovering my mouse now. Midway here, the dog will begin to feel hot instead of warm because it is too close to the fire. Now, let's say the dog doesn't know the dangers of fire. So it keeps going closer and closer and closer until in the upper section, the dog actually touches the fire and it gets burnt. Okay, so it suffers some burns. Now, once it suffers some burns, that is not a pleasant feeling for the dog. So that is a negative reward for the dog. Let's say a negative reward of -10. So immediately the dog is going to automatically associate benefit and dangers with fire. And the way it's going to do it is it is going to infer from the fact that when it was a sufficient distance away from the fire, it got warm, but it didn't suffer burns. And when it got too close to the fire to the point that it touched the fire, it got burnt, and that is not what it wants to suffer. So the policy here is that the dog has learned a sufficient distance that it needs to allow between itself and the fireplace to achieve its goal of staying warm. And so, since the dog wants to stay as warm as possible, it might keep going closer and closer and closer and closer to the fire until it is warm enough, but it is also not getting burns. Okay, it is not suffering burns. And this is what training in reinforcement learning is all about. So you dump the agent in the environment, and the agent begins to associate states. So the state here could be the fact that one, the dog's position could be a state. The distance between the dog and the fire could be a state. Okay, and then the action is going to be the distance that the dog stands away from the fire, and the reward is the warmth or the burn it suffers when it gets close to the fire. So that is the components that are involved in reinforcement learning: trial and error. That is a key word you need to drive home, that reinforcement learning happens through trial and error. So you dump the agent in the environment. You don't tell the agent what is a good action or what is a bad action. Rather, you give it evaluative feedbacks based on the actions that it takes. So the agent is in the environment, it has a goal, it wants to stay warm. Okay, now how will it know? How will it learn how to stay warm? It is in an environment, it is seeing fire, it begins to get close to the fire, and it senses that the closer it gets to the fire, the warmer it becomes. Now it gets too close to the fire, and then it suffers burns. And so it associates in its brain the benefits of being away from the fire, a sufficient distance away from the fire, and the dangers of being too close to the fire. So this is just a real life example to help you drive home the idea of reinforcement learning happening through trials and errors. Okay, so thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.